Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm John Kiriakou, here with Ben Zinovich. The U.S. economy last month added 517,000 new jobs, a robust showing far more than last month's 260,000 jobs. Unemployment is down to 3.4%, its lowest level since 1969. These numbers come just a day after the Federal Reserve raised interest rates by 0.25%, a smaller increase than most of the increases that we've seen over the past year. The U.S. may soon enter or may already be in a recession, but with jobs numbers so strong, it'll likely be a short one. With that said, nobody has told us that these are quality jobs.
No, I mean,
right? These may be at KFC.
How many people you know are working also multiple jobs?
I know I'm one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I just think, like, does this mean that the Fed is just going to keep hiking these interest rates?
Right.
I mean, because they haven't gotten their goal.
Force more and more people to work at KFC.
Yeah. What has been their stated goal?
That's
it's
right.
to increase unemployment. And
that's right.
Yeah.
The House of Representatives yesterday voted to condemn socialism, a silly, unnecessary, and propagandistic move that we haven't seen in decades. The House resolution never defined what socialism is, and throughout the debate, it confused socialism with communism. Even worse, a majority of Democrats joined every Republican in voting in favor of the resolution. We've told you over the past couple of months about a myriad of polls showing Donald Trump leading in the race for the 2024 Republican nomination for president, as well as polls showing Trump losing to Ron DeSantis. The New York Times today released a study showing that among the most historically reliable polls, Trump gets only between 25% and 37% in a crowded field. That spells trouble for a man who has a committed base of support and has already been president for 4 years. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy said yesterday that the House will take up the issue of term limits, something that the Republican caucus campaigned on in 2022. There's literally no chance that the Senate would agree to term limits. Indeed, neither Democratic nor Republican Senate leaders will even allow term limits to come up for a vote. But Republicans in the House could make this an internal rule limiting members to 5 or 6 consecutive terms. That's 10 or 12 years. We'll see what happens. In Manhattan, prosecutors warned yesterday that they could charge former Trump Organization CFO Alan Weisselberg with insurance fraud as a way to pressure him to cooperate with an ongoing investigation of the former president. Weisselberg is currently serving a 5-month sentence at Rikers Island, but he has steadfastly refused to cooperate against Trump. If Weisselberg continues to refuse to cooperate, he could face up to 5 years of hard time at either Dannemora or Attica. That could motivate him to reconsider his position. And Missouri, of all places, yesterday legalized recreational marijuana, putting additional pressure on the federal government to decriminalize weed. 21 states have legalized marijuana, as have Washington, D.C., the Mariana Islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Guam, and another 10 states have decriminalized its use. Steve Grumbine is the founder and CEO of the nonprofits Real Progressives and Real Progress in Action, and host of the podcast Macro and Cheese. He's also a leading activist and an evangelist for modern monetary theory. Welcome back, Steve. It's always great to have you.
You too, sir. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Today's jobs report, Steve, shows the lowest level of unemployment in almost 54 years. Yet we're said to be entering a period of recession. Help us understand the dichotomy here. Is the issue that these are just really crappy jobs? And if you want to be able to put food on your table or perhaps afford a place to live, you just have to have multiple jobs. Is that what we're looking at?
You know, I think, let me just say, I have had probably 10 people come to me seeking my statement on this. And because I am a guy who wants to make sure I put good information out there, I went straight to Dr. Randall Wray, who is one of the leading economists and one of the leading economists on a job guarantee, focused very heavily on labor. His response to me was very telling. I'm just going to read it verbatim. He says, if you look carefully, nothing in the labor market changed since the last report. The number may be too high and will be revised down. It may be the seasonal adjustment also, usually big layoffs after New Year, but that didn't happen this year. All the other numbers look the same. Number of unemployed, out of labor force, in labor force, etc. So I think that this number is going to be redone. It's going to be brought back down. I think that on a different level, I think it's very important to remember, we just went through a pandemic.
Yep.
And a lot of people left the workforce. A lot of people stopped seeking work during that time period because people were staying at home. Cost of living had dropped in some ways simply because people were not traveling, and they were able to keep costs in such a way that allowed them to make different choices in their lives. Well, as you've seen with Biden's most recent proclamation that the end of the emergency COVID time has come, okay, you see lots of efforts to get people back into the workforce.
Yeah.
And so this right here, you see poor jobs. The minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour. And then on top of that, as if that's not bad enough, we know inflation, I believe it's about 8.6% overall. And so you put the two together and you think about the increase in the costs of living and the absolute non-increase in wages. And what you have here is people that are re-entering the workforce after a 3-year pandemic. And you're seeing the fact that ultimately inflation has caused people to have to get more than one job. And what we're also seeing, and I want to make this tied into this, is the idea of a recession. People are not understanding that the federal government is keeping us out of recession, but not in a way that benefits you and I, so it still feels like a recession.
Right.
The thing is that those increased interest payments, that's new money being spent into the economy, but it's going for things that have no productive value whatsoever. It's going to rich people.
Yes.
And rich people will take that money, reinvest it. Companies will do stock buybacks. Everything will look good on paper. But the combination of why we still feel like there could be a recession comes from the fact that the money that is coming into the economy isn't coming in at the human level, at the worker level. It's coming in at the rich people level. And so it has no functional impact on the regular economy for regular people. So it feels very, very much like a recession.
And we should add, too, that most of these jobs are in the service sector. So it's not like anybody's producing anything. It's almost transactional.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And a lot of them are, and this is the most troubling thing. I wish that they were forced to put out a primary number, like one of the leading numbers that they talk about with permanent jobs. And I'm not talking about temporary seasonal. I'm talking about contract labor. I'm talking about when the state goes out there seeking a 1-year project manager versus hiring a project manager full-time with benefits and pension on the, all the above.
Yes.
We have so many people that get hired for 6-month contracts, 1-year contracts that have no stability in their life, that are praying to God that there's no downturn in the economy that would give air cover to laying off the contractors. And so this is a lot of smoke and mirrors, in my opinion, but it's also the natural outcome of ending a pandemic and getting back to quote unquote normal. And, you had it right. They want to create unemployment. So what did the tech sector do? The tech sector obliged them without even real drivers to doing so.
Yeah.
Each of them went out there and laid off tons and tons and tons and tons of people.
Right.
It isn't like they have no profits. They got tons of profits. So why'd they do it? I can't answer that question, but the layoffs are happening even without a rational reason for it.
Steve, I'd love to get your take on some of these Republican presidential polls. So many of them have shown Donald Trump just crushing everybody else. But today's New York Times says that among the most reliable polls, Trump actually does poorly, especially for a former president. With that said, it's still possible that Trump splits the opposition and wins a plurality of votes and a majority of the delegates because of the way the internal rules are set up. What's your take on these polls?
I think Donald Trump is an enigma. I think he represents strength that most people would like to avoid. But if Donald Trump were selected, I think sadly that their world would fall in line. But I think that they would like to avoid that happening. So it's kind of a weird mixed number. I don't think Donald Trump was ever the guy, even back when he was. It was he kind of by default. And then the more belligerent he got, the more people got on train because like, God, this guy's cocky. He's ready to do things that nobody else will do. And so I think that the first time it was like a taste test. Wow, this is weird. This is unique. This is different. I think part two, I think people are like, yeah, I had enough of, the original. I'm pretty much not down for another episode of this. But I think honestly that if he were to somehow or another overcome that he would end up getting all of them to fall in line. Where I'm concerned is that guys like DeSantis are Trump but competent. And I worry greatly that someone like a DeSantis, who a lot of people would probably fall in line and support, is a much more principled purveyor of the very things that we all, I think, don't want to see happen.
I was intrigued to see these comments, especially coming from CNN today, that this Republican nightmare scenario is that Trump, if he's not the nominee, won't endorse the eventual nominee. That's no different than Donald Trump in 2016. It's just that's the man's personality. Nobody should be surprised by this. But they're calling it the nightmare scenario. Is that in any way a nightmare scenario for Republicans?
No, not at all. And let me just say this. Obviously, the propaganda machine is real, and they have goals, and they may put it out there like we're just asking questions. But we know how that works, right? These are leading questions meant to make you think a type of way. They're trying to create a manufacturing.
Uh-oh, we've lost.
Essence. Sorry about that.
Oh, there you are.
I got a call that came through right in the middle of it.
No
Sorry
problem.
about that. But this is manufacturing consent. This is what that is. This is just purely manufacturing consent.
I would agree with that.
They're trying to make sure that people buy into a certain narrative so that when it comes to that time, the seed's already been planted.
Steve, the Republicans have been railing about socialism for a long time. And before I ask you this question, I got to tell you about a conversation that I had. This is a while ago now. This is about 10 years ago. I was married at the time, and I was at my in-laws' house. And they had invited this elderly woman from next door to come and spend, whatever the holiday was. It was probably Thanksgiving or something. And this woman was one of these people who just sits and watches Fox News all day long. And so I happened to be sitting next to her on the couch, and I said something. It was just like, how are you or whatever. And she says, well, I'm worried. She says, I think we're turning into a socialistic country. I still remember the use of the word socialistic.
Two things. When someone says socialistic or Marxian, that's when you turn around.
That's right. Well, I thought, I'm going to have some fun with this old lady.
You're like, happy Thanksgiving.
I'm going to have some fun with this old lady, I thought to myself. And my ex, who was my wife at the time, she really came down on me for this. But I thought, now this is going to be kind of fun. So I said, oh, I agree. I said, I think we should do away with Social Security and Medicare because, after all, what is it? It's a socialist program for people who are either too stupid or too lazy to save for their old age. We need to start with Social Security and ban it. And she looked at me like I was insane. And she says, well, no, we need Social Security. And I said, but it's socialism. So is the fire department, for that matter, or public school systems. It's all socialism. So yesterday, I was infuriated to watch the House of Representatives humiliate itself by passing a resolution condemning, quote, socialism, unquote. Conservatives frequently, usually, conflate socialism with communism. Most of them wouldn't know socialism if it walked up to them on a street and introduced itself. This silly resolution doesn't even bother to define socialism. It equates socialism with terrorism, and in the text of the resolution, it lumps together Stalin, Castro, Mao, and Nicolas Maduro, of all people. Just silly on the surface of
Mickey
things.
Mouse, too.
Why not? But many of us see a more sinister reason for calling this vote. I think this could be the beginning of a Republican backdoor to attacking Social Security or Medicare, right? After all, they're socialist programs. They were created during Franklin Roosevelt's Socialist New Deal. Very few Americans understand what socialism is. They just simply don't know the difference between socialism and communism. Pete Seeger, one of the greatest heroes of my life, once said that the greatest anti-communists are socialists. So was this just a simple propaganda vote in the House just to appease the Republican base? Or should we be worried about what this might lead to in terms of policy changes?
Well, first of all, if you were to really want to have some fun, go out there with a camera and a microphone at a Republican rally and say, can you define socialism?
Yeah, exactly.
And that in and of itself would be a Saturday Night Live skit made for the ages. But the problem with that is because they are ignoramuses and they are dull as spoons and they literally don't have any clue of any of this. This is the kind of bill that is the setup, in my opinion, for them to go about slashing things that are public purpose, public space things, and labeling them socialism. Socialism is not a basket of programs. Socialism is about ownership. It's about the means of production. It's about, is this public? Is this private? A lot of this is not the things that they claim are socialism, ain't socialism at all. Mm-hmm. So my fear when I see something like that is that they've now got their body, their base has heard, hey, yeah, they're fighting socialism. And so now anything that you label socialism, you put the scarlet letter on, you put the Star of David on, you put the whatever on, and you could say Juden, now all of a sudden they've got their thing to point at. So,
exactly.
Yeah, that's how I see it. Yep, we're on the same page for the usual.
And I think the way to sort of remedy this in a lot of ways, frankly, is I like you take Cuba as a country that was capitalist, was sort of the close friend of like Washington and the Meyer Landskys and gangsters of the time. Nobody knew. I mean, most people were illiterate, but aside from that, most people were sort of like, oh, I don't know what socialism is.
Right.
They have a revolution. The revolution is more about, democracy, fighting corruption, getting rid of the Batista dictatorship.
Right.
And then they start enacting land reform, the telecommunications. They get rid of the plantation system. And when at the first beginning of the blockade, which actually I think the anniversary of was either today or yesterday, in which JFK enacted the first sanctions on Cuba. Then you start, and during with the Bay of Pigs, you have Castro give this very lively speech in Havana saying, declaring the socialist character of the revolution. You say, well, do you agree with the land reform? Do you agree with our path to eliminating literacy? Do you agree with a program that no one has a right to own your own house? Do you agree with all of these things that we've set out, and XYZ, and which is sort of a way of educating. Like how does I mean, a lot of times we separate what is socialism and even what is capitalism. Like we don't talk about, victims of capitalism. We don't talk about, the enslaved people from Africa, those that were the people who were victim of genocide in the Americas. We don't see them as necessarily victims of capitalism in the same way that, this silly little resolution that came out of Congress.
It's funny you say that. I really like actually the way you frame that, because my side moniker, my Twitter handle is austerity is murder. And it's a word that most people don't use in the U.S. and Europe. They're very familiar with it. In Africa, they're very familiar with it. Even South America, they're very familiar with it. But when it comes to the U.S., this word somehow or another escaped popularity. But it's the right word. It's the word that we're talking about. It's really what we're talking about. It's the game that they use to control and condition us to accept less and to be pliable for the capitalist order. And you think about how you get there, how you explain this to people, and how you get them to basically to educate them, right? To educate them of how they use these weapons of economic destruction against their own domestic population. Yeah. And then you extrapolate that to the rest of the world. And if you're doing that with socialism and you're backtracking the way I just did with austerity, I think it's a great way of breaking that down, because at the end of the day, it's really the label they fear. And you can't blame people. Think about, I did a show a while back about duck and cover and the Red Scare and better dead than red. Sure. And all the rest of the all things that things. They plug. Yes. And they're very real. And for the era, for the people that grew up in that era, this stuff really resonates. And let's be fair, who are the average Republicans? They're old white people. Maybe they might even been Grateful Dead heads at one time that are now protecting their 401k plan. And so this mindset of better dead than red, and remembering their buddies that died in Vietnam, and remembering their buddies that died in Korea, and this is real, and it's passed down knowledge. And it's very hard to separate that emotional connection to hating a word. So getting past that word and being able to educate around about the very things you pointed out, Ben, I think that's a fantastic thing. I really do. I think it's fantastic.
Not
the question you had for me, but I wanted to make sure I made that point.
That's okay. Ben, what's the name of the new governor of Arkansas? What's her face?
Sarah Huckabee Sanders.
Sarah Huckabee Sanders, thank you. Sarah Huckabee Sanders said on Monday that with her as governor, the federal government is not going to be picking the pocket of Arkansans, right? Well, it turns out that Arkansans get twice as much money from the federal government as they pay in federal income taxes. So it's Arkansans who are picking the pockets of the rest of us. And what is that? That's socialism. That's socialism, right?
By their own measure, yes.
By their own measure. I want to ask you, too, about something that Kevin McCarthy was talking about yesterday. He plans to call a vote on term limits. I've come around on term limits, and I think now that they're a good idea. But the Democrats absolutely will not agree to such a thing, and neither will either Democrats or Republicans in the Senate. Can you see McCarthy going it alone in the House? Do you see term limits for Republicans there? And it's kind of a two-part question. Even if they do have a vote on term limits in the House, does that necessarily mean it'll stick? Because they can do it as the House half of a vote, which will then be rejected or not taken up in the Senate. Or are we thinking here about a change in the rules just among the Republican caucus, where the Republicans have term limits and the Democrats don't?
You know what? I can't answer that question straightforwardly. I have to kind of skirt around because I don't know the answer to it point blank.
I don't think anybody does.
What I can say is this. I think that the concept of term limits has a lot of, like, if you sat down in a room and did a brainstorming session, did your plus delta.
Yeah.
There's a lot of pluses to term limits, but there's a lot of deltas there too.
Yeah.
I mean, there are real meaningful deltas there. And the other thing is that if you don't have it pass through, both houses of Congress and then signed into legislation by the president, it's just a feel-good thing. It's just an idea.
Sure.
It's just something that we like.
That's all it is.
And so to me, I don't think anything's going to come of it. I think that it's an idea that is both terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Mm-hmm. And, to the degree by which we have any say-so in who gets in office and any say-so in the bills they take up and any say-so in the results of legislation, I think it's worthy of conversation. It's definitely worth talking about, because right now, you and I, well, maybe you could. I'm not going to talk about your wallet, but I can tell you about my wallet. I couldn't run for office. No. I couldn't put my career on hold and not take care of my family. I couldn't do any of that.
Nor could I.
So to run for office, you have to have money. Mm-hmm. And you have to have money privately to survive on.
That's right.
And you have to have connections. You have to have all kinds of stuff. So the way the system is set up today, it is very classist, very exclusionary, and very elite. So from my perspective, the idea of having term limits would necessarily make it so that regular people started getting more involved. There wouldn't be the capability of becoming a lifetime congressperson.
Yes.
I personally would much rather see the revolving door between industry and government be locked and closed forever.
Agreed. And
I don't
also
see any more people coming from Wall Street.
Yeah, and also public financing of campaigns, so that
absolutely. I think all finance should be done publicly for elections.
Every other Western country has it. No reason why we shouldn't.
Yeah, no, it always seems sort of, I mean, again, this idea of term limits seemed to come out of a reaction to one of the more popular presidents, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, for being reelected 4 times.
3 times.
3
4
times.
times. That's
4 times. And amid, essentially, as David Talbot talks about in The Devil's Chessboard, 2 attempts to overthrow him on behalf of Wall Street. So I think it doesn't necessarily scratch the itch of, are we implementing more democratic safeguards onto the thing of elections and elected officials itself. I think it, like you said, it is really more important to say, like, is the process that elects and chooses and hashes out and analyzes who these people really are, is that itself democratic? And if people are able to, if the common man is able to reach the echelons of power just as much as one of the more richer people like Trump, then who's to say, if they keep enacting popular policies, that they have a right to be reelected?
It's a real bag of tricks there, because there's a lot of different ways you can look at it. That's why I say I think if you look at the plus delta there, it'd be pretty stacked both directions. There's a lot of plus that could be there. You get somebody good, you want them to stay in power. Why would you take away democracy's voice to keep them in? And the flip side, people, history shows people are very comfortable reelecting an incumbent, and it becomes reflexive. And so the parties don't primary them, and on and on and on. So you would need a fundamental change with something like ranked choice, or you would need some meaningful demand that there be a primary or something. Do you know what I mean? There'd have to be some measure there to prevent that that kind of, I don't think nepotism is the right word for it, but that kind of reflexive incumbent. We're just going to go with the incumbent because it's the devil we know. I think there's got to be some trigger, some mechanism that forces some change there. But
yeah,
beyond that, I can't really. And this is just me spitballing, gang. Let me.
No, I mean
that's okay.
That's good. I think I'm curious really how we can really like I said, I think it's going to take more than just sort of a cutoff, because if there are popularly elected officials, especially, I mean, there are, like, I think of what was his name in Detroit. Long term, he was the first person.
John Conyers.
John Conyers. He put forward Medicare for all.
Yeah.
He was popularly elected. Legacy. There's those people that have just been in Congress for a while, and maybe they haven't have like a perfect picture record, but their constituency loves them in some way or form. I see that being one of those cons that you raise. Like maybe it sort of is a stopgap measure to make sure that more progressive change is not enacted. You see that in the neoliberal constitutions that came after a lot of these dictatorships in Latin America. You can't have a consecutive term. So you have in Chile, you have a somewhat progressive, sorry, I'm blanking at the word, like leadership, and then they enact, maybe like a budget change, and it makes college free, and then you just get it reversed with this right winger, and it's this back and forth ping pong.
Back and forth. Yep.
Yes.
Agreed. I want to ask you real quickly, Steve, about Alan Weisselberg, the former CFO of the Trump Organization. He has consistently held off prosecutors in New York investigating the Trump Organization. He took a plea deal to a fraud charge and agreed to spend 5 months at Rikers. That's 5 months of hard time, right? But he was adamant that he would not testify against Donald Trump. I actually have a great deal of respect for that. You know my position on rats. But now prosecutors are forcing the issue, and they're considering charging him with insurance fraud. He would face up to 5 years at Dannemora or Attica. Again, hard time. But 5 years at Attica is different than 5 months at Rikers. So does Weisselberg testify? And why do you think he's showing this loyalty to Trump when Trump really hasn't been loyal to him?
There are times where the cure is more painful than the disease.
Yeah.
And what do they have on him that could ultimately hurt him? I mean, I don't want to speculate, but then again, that's what I'm left with, right? So the idea here, in my opinion, is why is this guy not tattling on Trump? Well, maybe he believes in everything Trump did and he's willing to take the fall. Maybe he's the guy that says, hey, I decided I'm going to stand on this and this is what I put myself into. And this is the other side of that picture. When I get out, they'll remember me.
Right.
That's one angle. The other angle is kind of the more nefarious angle, which is, hey, they got something on me that if I don't go with this plan, the alternative is far worse.
Yes.
And I don't know what that is. So, the speculation is, we can have fun with that for hours, but from my vantage point, it's one or the other, because I think to your point, when you are a person that's put in those kinds of positions, part of that role, good or bad, is in fact to be, kind of a confidant, to be the guy that hears the things that the others don't hear and help process that information and go forward. The flip side to that is I have a belief that right is right and wrong is wrong.
Yeah. And
when something was fundamentally wrong, the idea of, do I go ahead and do something with this information? I think that's an individual responsibility there that I'm not going to define for someone, but I think there's a valid case to be made that if you see something wrong, you should say something. Kind of the whistleblower's credo, if you will.
Right. Right.
So where do you go with that? I don't know, but that would be my take on that.
Steve Grumbine, thank you so much for joining us. Steve is the founder and CEO of the nonprofits Real Progressives and Real Progress in Action, and he's the host of the podcast Macro and Cheese. Steve is also a leading activist and evangelist for modern monetary theory. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik. We'll take a short break and come right back. Stay tuned.